The focus of my presentation this morning is on the critical issue of whether Canadians, for global environmental benefit, should alter our energy use so that we will somehow reduce greenhouse gas emissions and therefore meet the government's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And there's three messages that I want to leave with you today. The first is that the developing countries of the world are irresistibly driving the growth in greenhouse gas emissions, and that will make the transition, if any, away from fossil fuels one that will take many, many decades. The second is that Canada's current emissions policies and targets will inevitably impose immense costs on Canada's economy and business, with negligible, if any, benefits in terms of changing global emissions. In short, the costs of present and future climate policies are extremely high, and the benefits are virtually nil. Third, there is a better, more democratic approach to policy that emphasizes the balancing of the many goals that we have as a society, economic, social, environmental, and others, and that will promote rather than impair national unity. I call your attention to three points on slide 2 here. This is a graph that shows world trends in terms of energy demand over the last 25 years, according to the British Petroleum Statistical Review of World Energy. To allow for inter-fuel comparisons, all of the fuels are shown in a common standard, which is million tons of oil equivalent. And I want to call your attention to 3 points in particular. First, consumption of all energy sources grew by about 40% over the period and is continuing to rise. Secondly, fossil fuels, including oil, natural gas, and coal, which are indicated in the green, red, and gray bars, have been the dominant sources of energy over the period. And by 2018, they constituted 84% of the total. Third, the small dark orange line there represents renewable energy. After 15 years of governments spending literally trillions of dollars in subsidies, renewables represent only 4% of global energy use. What the graph doesn't show very clearly is the remarkable growth in the use of oil and natural gas. Over the period since 2012, oil demand, which is shown in the green bar, has grown at the annual average rate of over 1 million barrels per day per year. And by 2018, world oil demand stood at over 100 million barrels per day, the highest in history. Remarkably, natural gas demand is growing even faster. This graph shows how global greenhouse gas emissions from energy use have changed over the past decade, and the shares that are held by the OECD and non-OECD countries. The global emissions in 2018 were about 34 billion tons, up from 30 billion tons in 2008. So despite all of the rhetoric, their emissions are growing, not declining. Emissions in the more developed OECD countries have actually fallen, while those in the non-OECD, mainly developing countries, are increasing. In fact, the non-OECD emissions have grown 4 times faster than the OECD emissions have declined. Today, the developing countries constitute about 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that share will continue to grow over time as the people there strive to increase their living standards and to have access to the kinds of energy services that we in the developed countries take for granted. Despite that growth, there's over 1 billion people on the planet today that do not have access to electricity or to modern energy services. And they must cook or heat with wood when they can find it, or otherwise with dried animal dung. Every authoritative source of analysis regarding energy supply, demand, and emissions over the foreseeable future expect that emissions and energy use will continue to grow over time. I'm talking about the International Energy Agency, the US Energy Information Administration, Exxon, and British Petroleum. Those are the foremost authoritative sources, and they're unified on that point. You might be asking, what about the United Nations agreement to reduce emissions? Well, in fact, governments have been setting emission reduction targets for almost 30 years. They did so in 1992, in 1998, and in 2012. And every time the emissions exceeded those targets. Countries tried again at the COP21 conference in Paris in 2015. But they found that it was essentially impossible to come to agreement upon a mandatory target. And so they forgot about trying to do that. And instead, they declared a victory by agreeing that each country would submit voluntarily, every 5 years, a plan for how they would reduce emissions. They also set a, quote, in principle goal of trying to keep the rise in average global emissions to no more than 2 degrees Celsius over a pre-industrial period, and to avoid a rise of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. The targets that countries set for themselves are thus political ones. They're not legal. And they're not binding, and they have no penalties for non-compliance. 4 years later, of the 10 largest emitters, only the European Union is on track even to meet the voluntary targets that it set for itself for 2030. China and India committed to reduce their emissions intensity, not to reduce their emissions. In fact, China and India increased their total emissions by 39% over the decade from 2008 to 2018. And in 2018 accounted for 36% of the global total. 2 countries, 36%. Based on the present trends, the combined emissions of China and India will be somewhere between 18 billion and 20 billion tons by 2030. Now, in October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, issued a special report that the world must reduce its emissions to at least 17 billion tons by 2030. And if it does not, the 1.5 degree target would be exceeded. This is the basis for the claims that you often hear that the world faces catastrophe in 12 years. In other words, all the countries of the world other than China and India would have to cease their emissions, or else in 12 years the world will end. Now let's turn to the Canadian situation. Canada annually produces about 1.6% of global emissions. This graph shows the trends in Canada's GHG emissions since 1990. And as you can see, emissions rose fairly steadily until they reached a point of 744 megatons in 2007. And they declined during the global financial crisis to 682 megatons in 2010. And have risen very slightly ever since, so that in 2017, they reached 716 megatons. So what that means is that after 27 years of climate policies and the expenditure of tens of billions of dollars on climate programs by all orders of government in Canada, Canadian emissions in 2017 were 115 million tons above what they were in 1990. The only period of significant emissions reduction was during the global financial crisis. So clearly, serious and prolonged economic recessions are very effective in reducing emissions. The current political target is to reduce emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. That would take us down to about 512 million tons by that year. Obviously, a sharp departure from past trends. According to Finance Canada projections, the Canadian economy will grow by 28%, and our population will grow by 16% in the period to 2030, which only adds to the difficulty of reducing emissions. There's significant pressure from the Green Party, environmentalists, and some provincial and municipal governments in Canada to adopt the more stringent target of a 45% emission reduction from 2005 by 2030. Attaining that particular target would require us to reduce our emissions down to about 401 million tons per year. Those who argue that we're facing an imminent climate catastrophe demand that the world aim for a, quote, net zero emissions, unquote, goal, the complete elimination of fossil fuel use by 2050, if not sooner. But what do those targets mean, actually? The party leaders during the recent national debates in Canada talked about percentage reductions in emissions, kind of in incomprehensible terms called 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide. And Canadians have great difficulty envisaging what does 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide mean. The issue really is not about that. It's about something far more tangible and important. The cost and reliable availability of the energy services upon which modern society depends. I'm talking about light, heat, air conditioning, mobility of people and goods, and the thousands of different services that we get from the use of electricity. To understand this, it helps to examine the consequences by economic sector. And this pie chart, which comes from Environment and Climate Change Canada, shows the breakdown of emissions by sector in Canada. Note that the oil and gas sector accounts for the largest share. It's about 27% of Canadian emissions due to the emissions intensity of the production process itself. Transportation accounts for the second largest share with 24%. And there are roughly similar shares of about 10% each for heavy industry, electricity generation, buildings, and agriculture. So waste and others accounts for about 16%. When one looks at the regional distribution of emissions, a different and very important point emerges. Alberta and Saskatchewan together account for about 48%, almost half of Canada's total emissions. And therefore, they're extremely vulnerable to policies that seek to reduce emissions on a percentage basis. If you add in Ontario and Quebec, you basically account for 90% of Canada's emissions. I could spend an hour describing to you what I see as the flaws in the current Canadian policy paradigm with respect to climate change, but I'll spare you and try to be relatively brief. In the 1990s, when we in government were advising on the various options that were available to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we basically tried to find the most cost-effective ways of doing that. But by 2000, that approach had largely been shunted aside on the basis of the thesis that the goal was now to, quote, save the planet. And therefore, the considerations of cost and cost effectiveness were really not all that relevant. At the core of current Canadian climate policy, in other words, is the ideological conviction that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the most important public policy goal. In fact, it transcends all others. And Canada has a moral obligation to do everything possible to reduce emissions. Among other things, this kind of approach justifies using every item in the policy toolkit. Regulations that tell you what to do, regulations that prescribe you from doing something, subsidies to producers, subsidies to consumers, taxes, tax incentives, research and development, and on and on. Extraordinarily large number of measures. The federal government alone has over 300 different climate action measures, they call it, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. And the provinces have even more than that. Every day, the municipalities in Canada add to the list. So compare that to carbon dioxide pricing or taxation. The theoretical rationale from an economic perspective for carbon dioxide pricing was that it would allow us to forego the use of all of these direct action measures and that are far more intrusive, except that we have those hundreds of different intrusive measures and no government intends to get rid of them, which thereby essentially eliminates the economic efficiency argument for carbon dioxide pricing. At the heart of the current climate policy approach is the belief that governments can manage the use of energy in the economy by controlling directly and indirectly which energy sources companies use and people use. They can do so through regulation, taxation, and altering competitive conditions. The public debate on the climate policy instruments has been focused on carbon dioxide taxes, as I mentioned, largely ignoring the equally, if not more costly, direct action measures. And of course, carbon dioxide taxes under the current regime will rise to $50 per ton by 2022. But that's only the beginning of where they will go in future. The Parliamentary Budget Office, in its review, found that to meet the 2030 target, taxes would have to rise to at least $102 per ton. To meet the Green Party goal, taxes would have to rise to about $300 per ton. To meet the so-called net zero emissions goal, taxes would have to go far, far higher than that. The government has deflected criticism of the tax largely because it's been able to say that we will recycle the funds back into the economy through rebates, which ignores the central fact about carbon taxes, which is that they're intended to make fossil fuels far more expensive for consumers and for industry. Businesses generally are not going to get substantial rebates, so the rebate system is essentially a thinly disguised income redistribution program, essentially to penalize energy-intensive industries and those provinces that rely very heavily upon hydrocarbon development and use for their economic activity. One element of the carbon dioxide pricing regime is the output-based pricing system that's applied for industry. This will entail a very high level of administrative discretion on the part of Environment Canada as to which level of emissions intensity will be set as a baseline for each industry. For an individual company, where the baseline is set can make the difference between staying in business and going broke. This quasi-central planning approach assumes that governments are all wise, have perfect information, and rarely, if ever, make mistakes. In 37 years in government, I never saw those conditions once. The most damaging effect of carbon dioxide pricing is on the competitiveness of Canadian firms. Canada's largest trading partners are, of course, China and the United States. And the United States federal government imposes no carbon taxes. The regional governments in China oppose carbon taxes that amount to about $2 per ton. So over time, as Canadian carbon prices and taxes rise higher and higher and higher, it will put Canadian firms increasingly at disadvantage relative to our major trading partners, resulting in reduced business activity and reduced investment in our industries. I propose to use the Environment Canada and Parliamentary Budget Office analyses that have been done as a basis to describe what the attainment of the current and proposed emission reduction targets will mean for the sectors that are most effective. Environment Canada acknowledges that Canada will not meet the 30% emission reduction target by 2030. The PBO analysis that was done subsequently concluded that it could be done, but only if one raised the carbon tax to that $102 per ton level. So Environment Canada projects that with the currently approved measures, emissions from oil and gas will remain stable from 2017 to 2030. Well, stability sounds okay from one perspective. There's no growth, but there's no contraction either. If you follow the lines proposed by the Parliamentary Budget Office, however, the additional taxes will have the effect of reducing oil and gas emissions by 37 megatons per year from 2022 to 2030. That's about a 19% reduction in our oil and gas emissions over 8 years. As those emissions reductions are essentially driven by higher taxes, it's reasonable to assume that their effect will fall primarily upon the highest cost energy production, which is the production from the oil sands. Now, oil sands production in 2017 were about 80 megatons. A 37 megaton reduction represents a 46% cut. Even with major efficiency improvements in the production technique and no additional oil sands production, that would be extremely unlikely to happen. Imagine the reaction if the federal government proposed a 46% reduction in the automotive industry in Ontario. That's the thing that the Albertans are facing in terms of their most important industry. Environment Canada projects that emissions from electricity generation will be reduced from 74 megatons to 26 megatons by 2030. It's largely through a sharp reduction in the use of coal-based power plants. That's being done in two ways. There's a federal regulation, but a number of provinces have also instituted electricity policies that terminate the use of coal-fired power plants before the end of their normal economic lives. Some provinces have combined the coal phase-out program with subsidies for the increased use of renewable energy. We in Ontario know exactly what that means. In the 2015 Auditor General report of the province of Ontario, the Auditor General looked at what exactly that has done to electricity prices in the province. And it found that from 2004 to 2014, the portion of the residential and commercial customers' bills covering electricity generation costs increased by 80%, from 5 cents per kilowatt hour to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. The overall cost of electricity to consumers increased by 56%, from $12 billion in 2004 to $19 billion in 2014. By 2016, in Ontario, which once had among the lowest electricity rates in North America, it now had one of the highest electricity rates in North America. According to analysis that's been done by the Fraser Institute, Ontario lost about 75,000 industrial jobs as a result of those electricity policies. So increasing reliance on wind and solar energy will have important effects on costs and also on reliability of supply. Both are intermittent sources of supply, meaning that they produce energy only when the sun shines or the wind blows, respectively, not necessarily when consumers demand the power. Utilities have to rely upon backup power sources, generally speaking, from natural gas-fired plants in Ontario. With some exception, bulk electricity storage may be used, except that it's very expensive and unavailable in the amounts that would be required if renewable energy were to become a very large proportion of total generation. My colleague Tom Harris is going to have a lot to say about this next. On transportation, it's a key sector for emissions reduction, as I noted before, and it's one where the implications of emissions reduction are going to hit the average citizen much more right across the country. Let me illustrate with a couple of points. 97% of the energy used in transportation in Canada comes from oil fuels. Consumption by light-duty vehicles, that is cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks, represents only 12% of total Canadian emissions, or about 85 megatons per year. So what that means is if you could somehow eliminate every car, SUV, and pickup truck in Canada, so none of it, we all went back to riding horses, that would only take us slightly more than 1/3 of the way towards the 2030 emission reduction target. Environmentalists and urban planners have for years been trying to persuade people to use public transit. Even if one could somehow reach a stretch goal of doubling the number of commuters who use public transit, and of course adding on the significant additional transit capacity that would be required to accommodate that, that would reduce Canadian emissions by only 2.4 megatons, or 0.3%. Environment Canada projects that current policies will reduce emissions in Canada in the transportation sector by about 33 megatons by 2030. That's extremely unlikely to affect freight traffic, so the burden will fall upon private passenger vehicles. Increasingly stringent vehicle emission standards will have a significant effect on vehicle costs as well as on fuel use and emissions. Look at all of the existing excise, sales, and carbon taxes on gasoline in Canada. That's equivalent to a carbon tax of $193 a ton. If one really thinks that by adding an additional 12 cents per liter is going to fundamentally change Canadians' driving habits, I think they better think more carefully about that. Electric vehicles? Last year, electric vehicles accounted for 2% of Canadian vehicle sales. At the global level, if sales of electric vehicles could be increased by 100 times from their current level to about 400 million vehicles, they would displace only 5% of global oil consumption. Buildings account for 17% of emissions, and Environment Canada estimates that existing policies will reduce emissions by 20 megatons overall by 2030. The Parliamentary Budget Office estimates that raising carbon dioxide taxes for even further would reduce emissions by maybe another 8 megatons. Part of the reason for this is the stringency of the building codes. And the federal government is committed to adopt a net zero ready model building code by 2030. The incremental costs, if all provinces adopted such a code, would be between $100,000 and $150,000 per house, added on to a new house's price. Now, assuming that the cost of household energy is between $2,000 and $4,000 per year, in other words, a net zero house would take 25 to 50 years to pay back. Under the low end of an estimated cost of a net zero house of $100,000 per unit, moving to mandate the use of net zero houses would add $20 billion in additional costs to the Canadian economy. Proponents of the Green New Deal in Canada and a 45% cut in emissions by 2030 have not said exactly which measures they would propose to use. So you have to speculate a little bit here. I've put some examples down to give you a sense of the at least qualitative impact on the Canadian economy. The first thing you do, of course, is you'd complete the complete phase-out of the coal-fired power plants, which would particularly impact Alberta and Saskatchewan. But if you have to go a lot farther, you would have to eliminate all oil sands production. You could eliminate about a third of our conventional oil and gas production. You could try to cut light-duty vehicle emissions by about 60%. You could undertake a massive retrofit of existing buildings. That would be several $100 billion a year. You could eliminate about half of our heavy industry. And you could cut agricultural activity by 20%. If you did all that, that might get you to the 45% level. Of course, the Canadian oil and gas industry is one of Canada's largest source of investment and export revenue. It would be decimated, as would many mining operations and industrial plants that are energy intensive. There would be similar results in the emissions intensive industries like petrochemicals, steel, cement, metal fabrication, automobiles and parts manufacturing, pulp and paper. The total effect of this would be a sharp reduction in income, investment, and employment right across the country. I hope that I've been able to persuade you of the 3 points that are indicated here. Notably, the Canadian climate policies are very damaging to the country, and that the efforts to attain either the 30% reduction targets or the more demanding targets would make matters much worse. In Canada, we need a far more positive and democratic approach to energy and environmental policy. It should be based on the premise that energy services should be plentiful, reliable, and inexpensive. Consumers and businesses should be able to choose, based on competitive markets and the availability of technologies, which energy sources to produce and use. The overreaching policy paradigm should emphasize democratic decision-making within a multi-goal pluralist framework, an emphasis on balancing costs and benefits, and a preference for the use of cost-effective policy instruments. No one denies that the Canadian energy economy will go through a transition in future just as it has in the past. Energy transitions, however, should be guided by the choices that Canadians freely make, not by the whims of politicians or the dictates of ideologies. Thank you very much.